Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And we welcome you to our fifth in-house counsel forum program. My name is Akash Chaube, and I'm a partner in Khaitan & Company's corporate private equity and M&A group. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to this webinar to every one of you, whether you are in our audience in India or around the world, and especially to those who are taking the time out after the extended Independence Day weekend. The in-house counsel program is a new program from Khaitan this year, following the tremendous success of the firm's virtual M&A programs over the last 2 years. The in-house counsel program is designed to be a private educational program and discussion forum tailored for in-house counsel teams in India. The program is structured to provide bespoke professional training and education, not only in substantive law, but also management and other topics of interest to in-house counsel. The forum is private in the sense that participation is by invitation only and not open to public at large. We issue invitations by emails to general counsel, chief legal officers, and senior in-house counsels in client and close associates of the firm. And our invitations are extended to not only individuals, but all members of their respective in-house legal team. We hope that through this process, to provide continuous legal training and education to in-house counsel on matters of interest to them and their respective companies. In terms of today's agenda, let me just see if the slide is coming up. In short, the format will be a discussion with our expert panel members, including a Q&A session with audience questions. We hope that the session will be interactive, and we invite you to ask questions during the webinar as issues arise. We have already received several audience questions. If you have a question, please submit it using the facility in the webinar portal. If we cannot cover all your questions during the webinar, we will respond offline by email after the webinar. Also, summary notes of the webinar will be sent to you after the webinar as a matter of course. We are aware that management in the legal landscape is a two-way street, which requires effective collaboration between the in-house and the outside counsel. As members at law firms, we understand how critical it is to strike a balance with the in-house legal team for effectively managing their business. In Indian context specifically, as compared to a decade or so back, the in-house legal teams are now much larger, better organized, and in most situations act as a true business partner to the teams of their respective organizations. Today, we are looking at this from a different lens to understand the take of in-house counsel on how to effectively manage outside counsel. In this session, we hope to discuss and reflect on a variety of considerations, including issues and challenges faced by in-house counsel while engaging outside counsel. I must introduce you to our expert panel now. Every person who has registered for this webinar today has already received an email providing credentials of our experts on our panel today. So I will not spend much time repeating or summarizing their excellent credentials. Suffice to say that this panel is as good as it possibly can get with a wealth of experience, and the panelists have excellent credentials to speak on this topic. Almost all of them have worked at or with law firms extensively, and they come with a deep understanding of workings of an outside counsel. Today, I have with me Bart Gombert, who's a partner and Asia General Counsel at Bain Capital, Tejal Patil, who's the General Counsel at Wipro and member of Wipro Executive Council, Then we have Shashwat Datta, who's a senior legal director and senior counsel at Goldman Sachs. And last but not the least, Anubhuti Agrawal, who's a senior lawyer, South Asia and special projects at Cargill. So now let us bring in our expert panel members. If you can remove the slide, perfect. Thank you so much. To begin with, to set the context, I would like to start with a quick question to all our panelists. In today's times, legal departments are under tremendous pressure, like they've never faced before. While businesses are presenting great opportunities, even though we are living in a world with prominent ongoing supply and demand instability, rising geopolitical conflicts, and enhanced regulatory complexity. Considering all of this, according to you and in brief, what are the top 3 challenges that in-house legal teams are facing? Can we, if you don't mind, can we start with you, Bart?
Sure. Well, I think there's a lot of challenges, and you've mentioned some of them. There's obviously, we're facing a much more complex world and geopolitical environment than we did, say, 10 years ago, or even 5 or 4 years ago. And that doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. So I would say one of the challenges that we're facing is how we kind of organize the legal team, both internally and externally, around those challenges, because it's clearly no longer the case that you can just have a bunch of lawyers internally and then a bunch of lawyers externally, and then you'll solve those problems. There's now also public affairs people, public relations people, regulatory consultants, political consultants, geopolitical consultants, some of them internal, some of them external. And so that cooperation is just much more complex, because you're not necessarily dealing with people who are lawyers, you're dealing with people who may have different work styles and different kind of cultures, and you have to still leverage all that help into answers and action. And that's very different from what it used to be, where it was basically lawyers, lawyers, and lawyers. And I think that's kind of going to continue to be a big challenge. It's also very interesting. It's kind of actually makes the job more interesting also, but it's also much harder than it used to be.
Very interesting, very interesting. Tejal, if you can, lean on what Bart is saying from your perspective and the fact that, you're part of this large IT services company with exposure in India and globally. How do you see the key challenge when it comes to, from your perspective?
Start with, a broad view of what I think is changing. So we've always, talked about a lot of regulation. This has been a standard thing. Regulation is increasing. Regulation is increasing. But what is happening now is a little bit different. Regulation is not just increasing; it is diverging because of geopolitical considerations. So let's take, for example, the privacy law. Right? There was one GDPR back in 2015-16. We thought most countries would just follow what Europe had started, but we today have almost, I think, 137 odd countries that have their own privacy legislation, and they are not identical. So what I'm feeling now is, while regulation is increasing, it's also becoming extremely localized and has a lot of local considerations. Now, this for a global company is, of concern, because you are not going to have an expert person or a lawyer in every country that you're going to operate in. Plus, you may, we're lucky to be in an organization with a certain amount of scale, but still there is a limit to the cost of doing business when you are taking, this into consideration. The same thing is going to happen with artificial intelligence. every country has its own philosophy as to how they want to approach this. Everybody is going to go at it their own way. And there is a limited number of experts in the area. And what Bart spoke about is these are not just legal experts. Now we are requiring experts in different areas to contribute to this. So I think that's another big change in what we're seeing as a challenge for in-house lawyers. The third thing is you now overlay this with the social sustainability, doing the right thing, values, environment, all these considerations on top of every business decision that you take. So I just feel like it's changing in a very different way. It's not just the number, but it's also the type and the great divergence that is going to be very interesting and very, very challenging in the years to come.
Very interesting, Tejal, and I'm sure that I think you're absolutely right that it's both the breadth and the complexity. It's both the micro and the macro both changing and expanding. Shashwat, from your perspective, Goldman, the way it has all its sort of wings around the globe, and where you sit, how do you see that in your worldview? Shashwat, I think you're on mute. We cannot hear you.
Yes, sorry. Yeah. No, so when Tejal and Bart were speaking, right, I was thinking how the world actually has changed in the last 5 years. Very interestingly, I think last or the year before that. So I was always an India lawyer, right? I had done deals in India, and the idea was you need Indian regulations, take Indian regulatory approvals. Interestingly, for the first time, I heard that you actually needed antitrust approval to do a deal in India, not only in countries like Brazil, because we had presence there, but maybe also in countries like Ukraine, right? And which honestly was an eye opener for me that in today's world and it's truly a global economy right now, right? And it's for us sitting in a country, it will be very naive of us to think that, knowing just the law of the country that you are operating in is sufficient. So knowing everything on day one and knowing the risks on day one was very critical. But having said this, maybe because I was naive, I thought, no, one generation, it was an eye opener, I was saying. But rather than challenges, I think I'll say what I had told someone when they asked me, why did you join in-house from private practice? And that point of time, it was just an answer I thought in my head would work well. Was it will give me the experience to see both the sides. It will help me work in a global organization to see everything. I didn't that time estimate what work in a global organization means. Sometimes because we are a US law heavy organization, I had to actually spend 2 years learning about US investment laws. Because again, you can't say I will wait for US to open to give you an answer. That's honestly when Tejal and Bart were speaking, I was like, yes, this resonates with me. I think more than a challenge, what I slowly feel is a great change which is happening over the last few years is our business teams are getting more and more aware, right? So therefore, decision making and learnings are far easier that way because you're not spending time more with a second set of people explaining them what the risks are. And this adds to Bart's point that now everybody is coming together. It's no more law, you handle, rest of it we will. So which is a welcome change and which is a change happening because there are so many changes happening across the world.
Very, very interesting, Shashwat. Anubhuti is having some video issues, but Anubhuti, if you're there, if you can share your thoughts on this, and then maybe we'll come to our next, a bigger set of questions about counsel selection?
Sure. Thank you so much. I think just kind of combining everything that's already been said, one of the other big challenges is reputational issues, something that Tejal talked about, right? Your values, your sustainability, you overlay your business with that. And with the media, news, and social media so intrusive, I think lawyers are not just pure legal lawyers, you're business enablers, as we started this discussion stating. So, reputational issues where you see the brand name of the company or the business coming up, that's another key challenge that the law department is expected to address or take into account while we are working with business on it.
No, absolutely, absolutely true, and that's one theme that we, consistently hear from most of our relationships. Now that we have, we know what's on top of the minds of our esteemed panelists. I'm sure that there are several others who resonate with these thoughts. I would come to the first set of questions, which are largely on selection of outside counsel. Tejal, if you don't mind, I would like to start with you. And more specifically, that when you're planning use of an outside counsel, how do you decide what task you will give it to an outside counsel and what work you would like to do internally? And while responding, it'll be great if you could also indicate what type of work you will never send to an outside counsel.
So look, I am a big believer in getting as much done in-house as possible. Okay, may not be resonating very well with our law firms, but the idea is this. The in-house counsel are closest to the business. They understand the business nuances to every legal question that needs to be asked. So while I've always traditionally gone out, we go out for M&A work, we go out for litigation because it's, we have to. And advisory is at a very different level. So let me explain how this thing works. Whenever we have a problem or a legal problem, my expectation is that the in-house legal team has done all the preliminary research. They have checked on the law, they have checked on the contract, they have checked on the basic business requirements. We only go
Tejal, I think we're losing Tejal, which is fine. Maybe we let her join back. In the meantime, while she responds, Shashwat, is there anything that you would like to add while Tejal comes back on this question? Because I'm sure that for you also, it will be a fair amount of split between internal and outside counsel work.
No, actually, we have a bit different because our teams are much smaller, and most of our work is investment related. So therefore, we would mostly work with counsels in most of our investments. And once you start working on that, you are, working with them on most of your work. Having said that, do we not send something to outside counsels? We used to not. For example, things like engagement letters and NDAs. But because again, we are such a small team, in Asia, as a matter of fact, we had to start outsourcing a lot of that work. For us, it's actually quite linear that way. If a deal comes, if there's a litigation, we'll go to one of the counsels whom we have worked with. And I think in India, we have slowly seeing it's more about going to a specific partner whom we have worked with, who understands us, and who, because understand the complexity of the organization. And therefore, we keep going back to the same person, even if they have, sometimes moved offices, which we have seen so much often in India.
That's very interesting, and that is a good segue for me to ask Bart. Bart, how do you typically select an outside counsel? Do you go by expertise and context of a matter, the relationship with with your team may have, or the relationship with the business teams or brand? I know there was a conversation about reputation. How do you typically go about an outside counsel selection, whether India or in broader region?
Yeah, for us, it's the same in all the regions, actually, whether it's in North America, Europe, India, China, or Japan. And the answer is we select based on all of the above. So obviously, we kind of take for granted people's knowledge of private equity M&A and private equity financing, because that is what we do. We buy companies, we sell companies, we finance acquisitions. So when we choose lawyers, we kind of assume that they know all of that, and there's plenty of law firms who know that. So that's not usually the problem. And then it's kind of a question of reputation in the market, kind of our relationship with lawyers within that law firm from kind of previous deals, because we don't do that many deals. We look at a couple of dozen deals every year in Asia, and we sign and close maybe 5 or 6. Each of those are very large, but we don't really do much more than 5 or 6 deals a year. And that means that we tend not to experiment too much. That doesn't mean we never change lawyers, because we do, and we do change law firms. But it's usually a very kind of deliberate, thoughtful choice that we decide kind of collectively between the legal team and the investment team. So the investment team will never go out and choose lawyers by themselves, and I will never go out and choose lawyers by myself without the investment team. So it's very much kind of a consensus building and trying to decide what the best lawyer and law firm is for a specific deal. A lot of it increasingly, and this goes back to the importance of regulatory in today's world, a lot of it is also driven by, because so many lawyers can do private equity and private financing, we then have to also see, are there other lawyers in that law firm who know this particular sector, especially if it's a sector that's subject to very specific regulation. That kind of content knowledge, kind of subject matter knowledge, becomes more important in that particular deal, and that will partly drive also what law firm we choose. But it's largely, yeah, as I said, it's kind of a consensus building between the investment team and the legal team, and then reputation and repeat. I would say repeat business is important, because the more you work with the same lawyers, the better you work every time.
Right. That is true.
All clients are different, all lawyers are different, and so the first time is always a bit more intense, and then as you repeat the exercise over the years, it does become easier. And so over time, you do become kind of wedded to not one lawyer or one law firm, but to a limited set, I would say.
Understood. No, I think very, very clear. Anubhuti, if you're there, and my next question is for you. This may sound a bit generalized, but there is a perception, whether right or wrong, that the legal profession is lagging behind other professions and industries in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Although there are some notable exceptions, women and minorities are often underrepresented at law firms and in-house law departments, particularly in leadership positions. Does this, or for that matter, values of a law firm, play a role in outside counsel selection?
I'll start answering this question in 2 ways, right? One, I think we've been very pleasantly surprised that compared to some other areas of industry, the law firms in-house or lawyers in in-house companies or private practice, you actually see a lot more diversity coming up in the last decade or so, particularly in the last 5 years. So which is always a good thing for us to see. And for us, Cargill, DEI is a really important factor, not just for us internally, but for all our suppliers. So we recently concluded an RFP for paneling law firms in Asia Pacific. And across the various 10 countries that we were having panel firm selections for, DEI is an important factor. So we actually had scores and we have KPIs around it. Now, DEI is normally assumed to be just kind of women or minorities. We also look at DEI from the lens of, in that country, what is relevant, right? It could be physical differences that law firms have, and they encourage people or associates with that to be in the firm. So DEI is a really important criteria for Cargill, and I must say, increasingly, it's there for most companies and clients, right? Because what DEI does, it also brings you difference in thought and different in perspective when you have a problem that's posed to a firm, right? You have different perspectives that come up. And values of a law firm is totally up there. I don't think we would ever go with a law firm which has any kind of blemished values or reputation anywhere. Whether it's fair or unfair, that's another debate. But I think as lawyers, our reputation is paramount. And we would want to go with that for our outside counsels that are on a particular matter.
Right. Absolutely. Tejal, glad to have you back. We missed in the last few minutes.
Sorry about that.
So,
Internet
no problem at all.
has been slow.
I can imagine.
So I unfortunately, no solution. It's just gone off.
Absolutely. Shashwat, just from your perspective, I have kind of two parts to my next question for you. One, of course, is that apart from traditional law firms, do you use let's say, at one end of the spectrum, specialist boutique firms for, say, complex high-risk work, or at the other end, legal process outsourcing firms for high-volume work? Do they undertake legal functions? And the second part is that how do you see this developing in the future?
Yeah, so we would really not go to a specialist boutique firm. And I'm just going to take a leaf out of what Bart had said earlier when choosing a firm, right? That I think most law firms that we work globally or in India, we would have chosen them basis the kind of work we do. Unless and until the law firms we work with have said that no, we don't have that expertise, maybe then we will seek out, but in most scenarios we will not. Also, in most of our deals which we do in Asia, we would have a counsel who is local to the jurisdiction and a counsel like a Kirkland or a Sullivan who will come with specific aspects. For example, someone may come with certain US law related aspects. Some may just come to solve our FCPA OFAC checks. Those are very specialist work process which go to very specialist people, but they are still part of the bigger law firm sector. But yes, there are certain high volume work that we do outsource, especially our NDAs and the ELs. And we have started to outsource it very recently. And very interestingly, currently, the way we are working on it is one of the Indian law firms is handling the entire outsourced work for the region. And when I say region, it means, Asia, Japan, and Australia. But what is interesting is, and the hurdles that we face in such scenarios is because the region has a lot of local language work, a law firm in India may not be best placed to solve for that. Which is why even though we will still look for outsourcing, we are slowly looking at options where we can have AI help us do a lot of the prelim work, and then a set of lawyers who help to take it forward from the negotiation perspective based on a playbook that we have prepared. I don't know if I answered both your questions.
No, I think so. You did, and thank you so much. Tejal, you have any perspective? Is it from your standpoint? Is it just adding on to what Shashwat said? I mean, the fact that just before that, just for my knowledge, Tejal, how large is your legal team at Wipro today?
Well, it's not just legal. To Bart's first comment
Yes.
about having non-lawyers, so along with all the non-lawyers, it's about 150 people. So, but like I said, it's not all lawyers, right? So you tend, we have data privacy professionals, we have intellectual property professionals, government relations. So it's pretty wide based on how the role of the general counsel has evolved in the organization. My predecessor even had risk, so it's pretty vast. Just in terms of selection and when we look at boutiques, etc. I think sometimes it's a pull and a push between large firms and boutique firms. The reason also being that they can't handle scale. When there are boutique firms, while they're very good at what they do, if you put a large matter on top of that, you don't always get partner commitment. I mean, I think a lot of them do say that we'll take less work, but in many jurisdictions, and especially India, that less work doesn't happen. So that is my only concern around sort of large versus boutique. My preference normally has been experts within large firms, specialist areas within larger firms, because then they can pull in a lot of manpower when needed in large transactions. So I think that's really the way that we've looked at firms. And really to go back to the question that I got logged off on is I will never go to an outside counsel unless I believe they're way better than my own team. So the chances of using somebody very junior or using someone who doesn't have an in-depth expertise in the area is rare, because otherwise we have the in-house team to manage it. And also you don't want to take away the joy from your in-house counsel, right? There is a joy in doing certain transactions, certain complex pieces, because they're all qualified lawyers. So I try to keep sort of that excitement with them too, rather than that old version of just being postman and transferring work to outside counsel.
That's true, and Tejal, that we see a significant sort of shift in the way Indian legal teams are being set up, especially in the last 5 to 7 years. I'm sure that Anubhuti also would be doing quite similar at Cargill. You're on mute, Anubhuti. You're not audible yet. We can see you. Maybe while that gets sorted out, Bart, I had while partially you responded to one of the previous questions about selection of an outcome counsel, but do you generally would have a panel, or it will be based on the relationship, like you mentioned, being developed over a period of time, socialized in a broader set of people, or it's a fairly straightforward panel?
Yeah, we don't have a formal panel, which I think is a very British thing. I think maybe I'm wrong about that. I think in the US it's maybe less common. We have ended up over time with a de facto panel, which we don't think of as a panel, but is kind of a panel, but it's not formalized. So we have a set of law firms that we work with on a regular basis, both international counsel and local counsel in specific countries. And so over time, we've ended up with a de facto panel. I think it's hard not to, because the alternative would be that you end up, for every deal that you do, with a completely different law firm, and you have to kind of re-educate them on how you want things done, who we are, what we care about, what we don't care about, how we work, also just the personalities of the deal team, how you work with people. You can't do that every time over and over and over. It just doesn't. life's too short. And so I think for that reason, you always end up with some form of panel, whether you formalize it or not.
Understood. And Tejal, you mentioned in your previous response that you will go to an outside counsel only when there's a genuine expertise. So I'm sure that for those areas of expertise, you will have identified, say, panel firms, or you mentioned about individual partners or individual pockets of expertise rather than at times in organizations.
We do have a formal panel, and that's really for two reasons. One is, traditionally you've had a panel being formed by the in-house team. So the in-house team would say, "Oh, I worked in this law firm, and so I must pass on some work to the partner in that law firm." Everybody has sort of personal favorites. I think sometimes that doesn't augur the best interest of the company. So what I did was I actually got all my senior lawyers together, and we did every 18 months a very thorough feedback session on every lawyer that we used, every external counsel that we used. We would go around the room. At that time, I had several portfolios under me, several companies. So there were some larger and some smaller. And the interesting one is that if a larger company would call up that partner, he would answer. If one of the smaller companies called up, he wouldn't answer. And when we had this collective feedback, right, we would get a sense of who's performing, who's an expert in their field, who is responding well to the organization. And we would give this feedback to our external counsel saying, everyone, whoever calls you must be treated sort of with the same attention. So I've always encouraged having a panel. We also identified areas which we lacked expertise in. So I think at that time, one of the areas was foreign exchange regulation. We didn't have an expert in the area, and we knew every once in a while there would be a matter that came up. So we would actively go and find experts in those areas. Now, we may not use them every day. It might be just for an emergency at one point in time. But we would have those experts on panel with pre-decided hourly rates, signed with a master engagement letter. And then within that, there would be flexibility to negotiate, a fixed fee or an assignment-based contract. We would also do tag teaming on panels. So say you have a litigation panel, we also had, other firms, non-lawyers doing discovery work. So then we could tag them to the litigation lawyers and bring down the overall cost of that. So I think, look, it removes conflict. It gets you the best in the industry. It creates a very active churn and conversation around responsiveness and experience that people would share dealing with these, because it's such an individual profession. It really matters. The other person really matters. I think in many jurisdictions, barring probably the US and the UK, it's not McDonald's, right? It's not like you will get the same burger wherever you go, even if it is the same firm. And so you really need to know the individual, preferably had experience. So we do check, and a lot of research is done amongst people have you dealt with so-and-so? Do you know how they are? I usually also call outside counsels to do trainings. And that gives me, all of us, I think, a lot of sense about, do they really know the subject? How are they sort of, because otherwise it's very difficult, right? Advertising, of course, as you know, is prohibited. We only have seminars. But it is important sometimes to bring in training, to bring in an ability to connect, to know if somebody is really good. So
Right. I think Tejal, all amazing points, and I would say a fact of training or a value-added service or conflicts, they're all I would say are critical in how sort of selection and performance measure of outside counsel is taken. Anubhuti, from your perspective, how do you manage? And I heard earlier in the call that you recently ran an RFP process. The RFP process, how does conflict come in between in terms of just dealing with the issue to mitigate it for future?
Akash, conflict is really, it's fundamental to a law firm and it's fundamental to a company, right? Now, as Bart said, maybe it's a UK thing, but as an American company, we have a very strict panel. So at one point at Cargill and my previous organization, we realized we had over 160 legal service providers across the globe. And therefore, there was a conscious effort, and it takes a lot of internal time to set up a panel. What should be the criteria? What should be the selections? And it can't be the same criteria that fits across all these countries, right? And we don't have local lawyers in each country. So some we have international white shoe firms or the magic circle firms, but very consciously in some countries, we also have mid-tier firms in our panel because we want to cut across all kind of factors or issues that may come in. Simultaneously, I'm digressing a little bit, but I just want to give you a little bit of background. We also have a very clear criteria of work that we would never give to a law firm, right? Or never give to any decent law firm because it's not worth their time and it's not worth our time to explain or get the right value out of them. We also have an internal contracts management team. So legal operations has become a big thing in most big companies and big legal departments. So we have very smart, sophisticated people globally, US driven, but also in Asia and Europe, who are managing the operations of the department, right? We have a group of 15 lawyers who are handling regular contract work across English language and Mandarin contracts currently. So if that is taken away, what you're giving out to a law firm is really hopefully sophisticated and interesting work, where as Tejal said, either they're smarter than us or we just cannot appear in court, or we need the bandwidth, right? We're doing a transaction in, I don't know, Bangladesh or Vietnam, we do need a local lawyer there. And we've also stopped what Shashwat was saying, overlaying a local lawyer with a foreign law firm. So as a company, we've taken a call not to do it. I think we would never have a Whiten case supervising a local law firm's work. Then that will be us doing it, right? Now, where does that take us in conflict? Now, ultimately, it's a business. Even for a law firm, right? They're not going to refuse a matter till they get meaty chunks of billing from you. And that is one of the reasons for us to have a panel that we consolidate our relationships. And therefore, when you're giving repeat work to a law firm, agnostic of which that partner is then, they would respect you. They would not, at least in contentious matters, go against you. Or even in matters where they get a call for being against you, they would come back and check with you once. Now, conversely, when you don't have that depth of that relationship, we have to be mindful that, ultimately it's a small set of firms in most countries, and any big transaction, they will get approached. So you have to take a holistic and a reasonable view. One thing that law firms love to do is Chinese walls. That as a company, we don't like. So I think there's nothing like a Bombay office and a Bangalore office is involved and they're not going to talk to each other. We would never do that. And the only other thing we would do, I would say, is when I joined Cargill, there were stories I heard about our senior financing lawyer in Singapore. He hated a particular firm in India. And I don't know why. Right. And I dug deeper and I realized there was a particular transaction that Cargill had become proprietary on a few years ago, about 8 or 9 years ago, and that got leaked to the market to the extent that our documents, the mistakes which were there in the document were there in the other document. So if things like that happen, I think it just becomes a no-go for us, right? So it's a complex question, but it is something that we look at both at a macro and a micro level. But a conversation around it always helps.
Thank you so much, Anubhuti, for sharing and sharing these anecdotes. Shashwat, from your perspective, the way GS is structured, I'm sure that conflicts for you gets amplified because of the number of business verticals that you have. And a lot of them have to work in isolation or talk less to each other.
Yeah, no, see, honestly, I am of the same school of thought as Anubhuti is. Uh, we would prefer, if we could, not to have walls and operate. But given how we are structured, it's mostly difficult to not give away or tell a law firm that you cannot act. Uh, I think in the number of law firms, and I'm talking now mostly from an Indian perspective, there are few law firms whom we have over the years liked and worked with, and I think they're liked by most of the other PE players as well. So, in such scenarios, I think we are quite practical. I think certain areas where we would take a call not to allow conflicts is in cases where we are doing a debt investment and therefore enforcement is a scenario, uh, or we are already in some kind of a dispute with uh, a counterparty and any kind of so of course, sir, just to clarify, we will never stop a law firm from or working for another client in a different mandate unless and until they are on the same mandate. I think we are good. But again, I think for us, it's again the 4 to 5 law firms that we work with. It's very difficult to not give the conflict clearance, even
Yeah.
with a wall basis. Do we like it? May not be, but that's how it is.
No. Thank you, Shashwat, for sharing that. Alluding to the point which Tejal made earlier about, they having a process for review for outside counsel, but in your, several decades of experience, including shared experiences with others, where do is there some common issues or common observations where the outside counsel falls short in expectations, whether it is with your team as the legal counsel or from business teams?
I would say the most common shortcoming, I would say, that occurs is communication. It's because we use top law firms, either top international law firms or top local law firms. So it's quite rare for us to see a lawyer who doesn't seem to be very good at law. That's very rarely the problem. What we have seen is that the way people communicate legal issues can often be a problem. And I would contrast that with kind of what I would call like the US style of lawyering, which is kind of issue, options, and then a very clear view of what the lawyer thinks the best option is, or the least worst option. And that's kind of we're very used to that. So we're very used to working with lawyers who have views, and then we debate those views, and we might disagree with them, but we want lawyers to have views. What we sometimes see in some countries, where people aren't always used to kind of have debates with their clients, is that you ask a lawyer a question and they will give you a legal answer. I sometimes have law quoted at me. People will say things like, Article 65 of the law of 1985 says, like, we're like immediately done, right? I have like no interest in what Article 65 says. And so it's surprising to me that it still happens. It doesn't happen every day, luckily, but it still happens that people give legalistic answers. Sometimes they will set out some options to handle the issue, but then even then they will sometimes refrain from saying, and I think option A is best because X, Y, and Z. And then you can have a debate about that. it is remarkable to me how many lawyers still seem to be reticent to give that advice. I think sometimes people think, and again, this is more prevalent in some countries than in others, that that's a commercial issue and a business decision, and it's not their role to thread into that field. But that's not how we work. We very much want people to thread into that field. That's what we pay for. I don't pay people to explain law to me, like a Google law. Actually, Google is already old-fashioned, probably AI law now, right? So we don't need any of that. We really need discussions. Plus, it's extremely important because the only issues that come to us as general counsels are the bad ones. If it's a normal legal issue and there's a normal solution for it, I'm not even going to know because it will already been solved by our external counsel, and I don't need to know. The only issues that come to me are the ones where all the options are bad. And then we have to decide which one we go with, right? And so per definition, those are situations where you have to have a debate because you are in a gray zone. All your options are bad options. And you have to then have kind of a conversation about trade-offs, wider context, the past, the future, and that's kind of really interactive.
I can see Bart
engage in that, then it doesn't work, right?
Yeah. No, I could see everyone nodding as you mentioned about some of the points about the common pitfalls. So thank you for that. And Shashwat, from your perspective, I heard both Tejal and Anubhuti talking about metrics and performance and identification of how people are doing. Do you think that a formal process to review performance of an outside counsel, you recommend it? I mean, generally, is it recommended? And if you were to, go down that path, what are the top factors on which you would evaluate the performance of your outside counsel?
Yeah. So, Akash, honestly, it depends on the size of the operations or the diversity of the operations that we are doing, right? Uh, for example, what we do as part of the investments, a thing to do like that, end of the day is a very concentrated part of the legal work. And therefore, for us in this line, it makes more a case of an informal review. And when we talk about, I think we do a bit differently, is when we review performance, we don't do it on a yearly basis or a regular basis for that matter. Uh, what we do is we will pass on feedback to the counsel as part of the transaction when the transaction is ongoing. We will, of course, have ongoing discussions with the law firm as we speak. Because honestly, for us, we have always believed that we are building a long-term relationship with the counsel, always, and therefore, our I don't think we have or would look at a formal process. But yes, a formal process always helps. And what both Tejan and Anubhuti were saying, uh, surely should be something that should be done. Uh, I would have loved to give you certain pointers, but for me, the way we work or certain factors that plays in our mind, and honestly, I think I'm going to borrow some of it from the various legal 500 chambers reviews that I fill up, is availability of the team during a deal. Because as Bart was saying earlier, knowledge is given, right? So how is a team, for example, and this is a problem we have faced quite a bit, is you have a really good senior partner. It's a hit and miss on the execution partner. And then below that, it's sometimes there is no one or a 1-2 year person, and the problem is the right amount of information is not flowing through the team, which means when you're calling someone in because someone is not available, you're not getting a correct advice or a proper advice. And which is why we would pass on the feedback then and there. So how you're staffing your team is very important. Second is, and we have faced with a few law firms in the region where law firms would end up overcharging you, which you would spend time after the deal, seeing, okay, this is the timesheet. Do we need to do this? Over the time, I think those will get corrected. But yeah, that is again something that we would look at. Uh, we have taken, or over the years, we have seen, and as Bart was saying, how you're giving the advice, right? Like, are you just telling me a fact or are you giving me an advice? So that plays a part. Uh, I think, moreover, and over the years, what we have seen is when we interact, a lot of feedback comes from the business team uh, on what do they think about the law firm in its current transaction, because they are the ones who spend most amount of time with the external counsel, right? So their feedback, did they claim, did they not, like, it's a human thing, end of the day, right? So all those factors is what comes, like, during the process, it comes together and we say, you know what, maybe we can do these things differently. And honestly, sometimes we educate ourselves. Sometimes it's not always as if the law firm has to do something differently. It is quite a few cases where we have to do things differently. Maybe our instructions were not correct. Maybe the requirement that we asked for was either had to be provided in much better time or in a more precise manner. So it's not always about providing a feedback externally, it's also looking in. That's how I would put it.
No, very interesting. You mentioned about just to paraphrase it, transparency in billing costs, or duplication or overcharging of time. So I come to my next set maybe of questions, and which I'd like to ask Anubhuti, you and Tejal, is when you're engaging, and Tejal, I think, alluded to that fact that billing rates, but typically when you retain your outside counsel, is it a fixed fee? Is it some other basis? Do you do alternate fee arrangements? And if you can also mention about out of scope things which you're not anticipating, how do you manage it? Maybe Anubhuti, you can start, and then we can get some inputs from Tejal.
Sure, thanks, Akash. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to go a little quickly on some of the key factors. I think in us lawyers, it's also really important that we scope out the question. Like as Bart said, we need to know very clearly why we're going to a particular law firm. If we are not clear, we're not going to get a clear scope of work. We won't staff them adequately. We won't get the good, right? So that's important for us. And we always would typically go for an alternate fee arrangement, at least if not for the whole transaction, at least aspects of it, right? Even in a litigation, you would set up with like the drafting fees or appearance fees, and you'd split it into as many eventualities as possible, effective, non-effective. Okay, negotiations, you can't put a cap on it, but at least creating the first draft, revising, and having periodic conversations with the law firm as the deal progresses, especially if it's taking longer than what you had anticipated. And I think the other big thing that as in-house counsels, we need to be mindful of is having clear lines of communication with the outside counsel. So just on one deal we closed in Australia this week, in fact, we had 3 lawyers from Cargill and 4 business people. And I know at one point in time, it was a big shoe, it was a white shoe law firm based out of Northern Australia. And I know they were confused. And that is reflected on their billing because they were getting approached by different people, right? So I think we can't always just say, you can't pass the buck to the law firm. I think as in-house lawyers, it is imperative that we have our house in order when you go to a law firm. Because they're also, time is money and time is knowledge. And you can't expect them to give that to you when there are conflicting instructions, or you can't expect them to give that to you for free either. So I think another one pet peeve is you would have done this for someone else. Why are you recharging us? As Bart said, I don't want to pay you for that section number. I expect you to know that. But how would that engage to my facts that I'm more than happy and willing to pay? Because if you don't, you're not going to get the right answer either, right? You are going to get a junior associate giving you something that maybe not be relevant.
I would just, echo what Anuzi is saying. I think a couple of things. All companies today want predictability of budget. So it's no longer a situation where the legal department is exempt from budget, saying that, everything is beyond our control and we are not going to give you an estimate of what our annual budget is going to be. So most people function on a budget. It's also really important for the in-house team to structure their budget carefully because you'll always have unexpected things through the course of the year, but the expectation is whatever you know about, you have estimated correctly. This doesn't always happen with hourly rates. So we usually go for hourly rates with a estimate of a cap, which is, we think that this particular deal or transaction is going to have X number of hours involved. And so we think it will end up in this area without a commitment of fixed fee for larger transactions. For opinions, we would always go in for a fixed fee. But again, I will echo a little bit of, if you don't ask the right question, you don't get the right answer. And this is where I think in-house counsels are playing a much more important role in framing the question. I have seen law firms who don't like questions framed very well because then they can do a 12-page memo on every single eventuality that can possibly happen. And so it is a two-way street that if you ask a sharper question, then you can actually narrow down on the answers you want as well as the fees. But the other part of it is, I differ a little bit with what Shashwat and Bart was saying about knowledge. I don't think knowledge is a given. I have seen many cases where external counsel are learning on my dime, right? In the sense they project themselves as being a particular expert in a field when they are not. And they are learning on your matter because they have to learn on somebody's matter. Now, this is where I think that really having a honest conversation with the counsel that you are engaging is important. I have had situations where I've got very senior names, and you would assume, that this person knows everything, and they've been highly recommended. And when they go before the regulator, they have never been before that regulator ever. And I'm saying, I have a critical matter. It's really, really important for my organization. I don't want you to learn on my matter. So I think that sometimes creates the problem about fees, is because then you think you are paying for somebody to be learning and not knowing. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Fantastic, Tejal, very candid, and I know I'm mindful of time, so I'll ask my last question to all of you, maybe starting with you, Bart, that if there is one change you would want to see in law firms to improve their ROI that you receive as a client, what would that be?
Well, I think it's topical to talk about AI these days. I would love, who knows where it goes, but clearly something has fundamentally shifted in the last 9 months. How are law firms going to use AI to deliver service in a probably fairly fundamentally different way and more cost-effective way? Because clearly, all of us have said we use versions of the hourly rate because it's quite hard to do fixed fees on some of the high-level things we do. That said, the fact that this is an industry, the law industry is an industry that has essentially not changed its revenue model for the last 150 years, something's wrong, obviously. And We've not been able to change that as clients. I think that's also true. We've tried, but I don't think as clients we've been tremendously successful in helping law firms to build a different revenue model. And I wonder whether AI is actually going to be the key to that. How that's going to come about, how fast it will come about, we'll have to see. But I think if law firms are not investing in AI and how they use it for the benefit of better service at a lower cost, I think maybe not next year, but 7 years from now, I have to believe those law firms will probably not be the top law firms in the day.
No, absolutely true, Bart. Frankly, this, both the generative AI and large language models are perhaps the biggest thing that the law firms are grappling, both from an efficiency and transparency perspective. Shashwat or Anubhuti, would you like to share your that one thing that you would like to see your outside counsels do better or change? Shashwat, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah. Honestly, from in addition to what Bart said on the AI and what he talked about giving precise advice, and honestly, things have been changing. But I'll quote a funny incident on AI, Bart. Recently, we were trying to outsource our NDAs to an organization who said they work with the big PE names and they employ AI. And we said, "Oh, that's great. We want someone like you." And we faced them opposite a transaction. And then we understood that all that the AI did was do a spell check. And which is where we were like, okay, fine. It's critical that we understand what the AI does, than just take on the face of it that people have AI. I think it is going to be a changing atmosphere, but I totally agree that unless and until people and honestly, people in the past have accepted technology, right? Like, for example, many of the magic law firms in UK had the templatization of a lot of things, right? I remember there was a software where you could put in the key terms and the term sheet would come, and the lawyer on the deal would check that, correct? So those processes were there. I think this is going to be much more efficient. How will it play out? Only time will tell. But yeah, I think that's going to be, if not already, a game changer.
No, absolutely. And Anubhuti, is it for you also AI or
No, I think I'm a little old school. I think for me, the biggest change would be simple English. I don't want to see notes or emails or memos with mutatis mutendi, inter alia, ipso facto. I think we are done with that. As Bart said, we need concise answers with optionality, right? Ultimately, everything has a risk. Us breathing today has a risk to it, right? You need to help us size that risk. And I think that's one thing I would like the law firms to do. And please use simple English. Gone are the days of like 200-page diligence report. You would still get paid as much, trust me, if you even give us a 20-page issues list versus a 200-page diligence report.
we're very candid, Anubhuti? Tejal, do you agree with that, or
Oh,
do you have
totally.
another?
I actually do training classes for my in-house team on simple English too. But the other thing, I'm going to be a little controversial here. See, law is industrializing. Okay, this is the industrialization of law now. Law is no longer just a profession, right? It's almost become a business. The one thing I want law firms to stop doing is being Robin Hoods. There is a cost of service. It cannot depend on who your client is. I have been in large organizations and I've been in startups, and the same person gives me a different quote for the same issue. I just believe that's over. I mean, people are sharing a lot more information. People know what fees are there. People know what costs are there. I think if we are looking at large industrialization of law, then we should also look at some sort of standardization or moralization of costs, because it's not that people don't know anymore. It's not a clandestine one-on-one client to lawyer relationship. We all talk, and sooner or later it's all out. So I just feel it would be nice to get some standardization. If there's always a range and always a cost of expertise that you pay, but I think it's time.
Well, thank you so much. I know we've just ran out of time. I will take up just one question from our audience poll, from our audience Q&A. And the question that, let me just quickly see, we have few that came in. Maybe, I'll let you decide who will respond to this. But the question that I've gotten is, do you brief your outside counsel on change in corporate strategy for your outside counsel to feel valued and to be your trusted advisor? In other words, you also going beyond transactional relationship. Any one of you, Bart, Tejal, whoever happy to go first.
Yeah, I'm happy to say something about that. I think we don't really change corporate strategy that much. We buy companies and continue to buy companies, but I do agree that it's very important that the relationship with your trusted legal counsel should not be purely transactional. I think that's extremely important. The things you do are so complex. You do have a lot of discussions that are really down to judgment. If you don't know that person very well, you've not had various discussions over time on various topics, it's very hard to know whether that person's judgment is good, whether they have a slight bias to a certain way of thinking. And so if your relationship with that person is purely transactional, I'm a little worried that you don't get to the right kind of nuanced answers over time. So I agree, you need to build, it's a two-way street, as someone said before. I agree. You need to build that, and it takes time and investment, I think, on our part also.
I think just understanding the company is important, and that's why longer term relationships work, because then the advice that you get is in the context of your organization. Because there are certain things as organizations you just won't do, or there are certain things as organizations you stand for. And it's important, I think, that the advisor understands the context in which they're giving the advice.
Thank you so much. And I would, would like to now conclude the session. And I would say that's certainly been a thought-provoking session. And there are a number of key takeaways. And for me, the top few would be that, life for outside counsel is tough but exciting. And they really need to develop deeper sectoral and business knowledge to be a true partner. The second takeaway for me personally is really effective communication and commerciality is perhaps the most common issue on which the outside counsel need to work on. And as more transparent and transactional and a transparent relationship are built between in-house counsel teams and outside counsel, the more efficiency and value the relationship will create. So on that note, before I close, I would ask each of you to respond to the poll. Mitesh, can you put up the poll slide? We'll just give a minute for audience to poll. So while this is going, the poll is going on, I would just thank everyone who participated in the poll. And finally, I would like to thank Bart, Tejal, Shashwat, and Anubhuti, who are outstanding, and also our audience to your attention. I hope you found the webinar interesting and worthwhile investment of your time. We certainly enjoyed bringing it to you. After the webinar, we will send you a copy of summary notes. You will also separately receive a request for your feedback. Please take time to send us your feedback, comments, criticism, and even compliments. It wouldn't take more than a minute of your time. Our contact information is on the contact slide. And we once again, thank you for attending today's session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.